Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. When Christopher Hazell was an atheistic college student, he found himself on a flight, staring out the window into the blackness. If God did not exist, he reasoned, then the entirety of life meant nothing. Sin and suffering can render the world dark and clouded, convincing us that our lives are utterly meaningless. He joins us to share his story and his thoughts on his story. Christopher is a writer and editor. His writing has been published in the Saturday Evening Post, Commonweal, Plough, Viewpoint, and a host of other publications. He's also the author of Ends in Mind, a newsletter about culture, technology, Christian spirituality, the arts, and more. Christopher, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm very, very well, thank you. Glad to be speaking with you.
Thanks for having me on.
Oh, no, very glad to speak with you. Your story sounds very familiar, and I would like to give you the space to give us the background that is the preamble to this moment that you begin writing about, that experience on the plane.
Yeah, so, was raised Catholic and wonderful experiences with the Catholic Church in many ways, wonderful parents, grandparents who were very devout. And so, and was mostly a good kid kind of throughout high school. And then when I got into college, as you said, kind of a common story, unfortunately, kind of drifted from my faith slowly. It wasn't all at once. Wanting to really be, accepted by my peers and still believing in God at this time, but not being tremendously baptized at this point. And so God really started to become more of a nebulous kind of therapeutic entity that I felt good about going to when I needed maybe to do well on a test or was worried about something, right? And but otherwise really was living a life, far from the church, right? Had no prayer life really, would go to mass really out of guilt. And I'm grateful that I did still do that, but that slowly started to kind of fade away as well. And so there's a lot to kind of what went in fully to this kind of experience that I kind of recount in this article, right? Where I'm on a plane. I was studying abroad in Italy, and it was my last year of college, and I was flying out there to spend 4 months in Siena. And leading up to that, though, I'd stopped going to mass. I had been in this relationship with this girl that was it was an unhealthy relationship. I was really, strangely, about a few weeks before I left for Italy, I came down with what was just a tremendous depression. And it was very strange because I was very, I would think I had a somewhat, on the outside, social life, and I was excited to be going to Italy. And, I had my whole life ahead of me and all this, and many of the people around me, right, were kind of going about their lives in this kind of normal way, typical kind of college life where you're, at least for me, I was living a very secular, hedonistic lifestyle. And I was just kind of struck with this powerful, despair now that I'm, in retrospect, I would say probably a type of spiritual despair, right? Where I just suddenly realized, nothing really matters unless there is a God. And what I'm doing and how I'm spending my time, and, I really didn't like the person I had become. I felt very selfish. I felt very kind of like narcissistic in the way I was approaching my life. I wasn't connected to the Lord in any meaningful way. I had no prayer life. But I was very good at pretending, right? I was very good at kind of putting on these masks. But I had this kind of revelation where I didn't know God. I didn't know whether God was real or not, but I did know that I was deeply despairing and depressed, and I didn't like who I'd become. And I'm supposed to be, excited about this trip out to Italy, and I have the whole life ahead of me. And I'm just, for some reason, I'm tremendously depressed. And I remember waking, I would wake up like in the middle of the night in kind of a terror of just what, it was very strange. It was a grace, really, but it was kind of a harsh grace, certainly at the time. And I think I came to this and I wrote about this in the article, where I had this terrible feeling that if there was no God, then my life really and utterly did not mean anything. And I think there's a lot of people that can find comfort in the idea of there being no God, right? Because in some ways you can say, well, now I can kind of live freely, or I don't have to worry about, this entity that's watching over my every move, so to speak, right? And I'm just not really wired that way. For me, it was really a terrifying prospect to think that we kind of exist in this cold, mindless universe, and everything I'm doing or not doing really doesn't matter. And so the fact that I feel bad about the person I've become really doesn't matter, right? It's just kind of a psychological experience that I'm having that doesn't matter. I could live my life one way or another. And that was profoundly upsetting to me. And so I had this moment where I was, again, going to kind of the article with on the plane, where I had to kind of admit that, like, either there's God and he can in some way give my life meaning and therefore maybe rescue me from this despair and this kind of nihilistic terror that I'm experiencing, or there really isn't. And to be honest with you, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do if it was the latter situation. I guess I would have to try to really distract myself with the life or the world. Thankfully, it didn't come to that. But and feel free to interrupt me, by the way.
Oh, no, this is good. Please.
Details or So I've thought a lot about that experience, and I've thought a lot about since how I used to think that my conversion was more intellectual, and I think to a degree it was. I think, and I'll go back to that in a second. But as I've gotten distance from that, years now, I think what it was really kind of this intuitive sense that I had that there had to be a God, that despite the difficulties and the suffering in life, that there had to be, I had beautiful moments in my life, right? I had memories. I was really drawn to certain music and literary art and the arts in general and beauty in general. And so that had always been something that I found couldn't be easily explained by just a material worldview. I struggled with that. So I feel like there was the reason I had this despair was that I felt that there must be something more, but I hadn't found it, and I was starting to think that maybe there wasn't. But I think it was really so when I then kind of came to this moment where I was like, well, I have to explore this for myself. I have to return to kind of the faith of my childhood, so to speak, and really do research and read the philosophers and theologians and see what the church teaches and kind of do this deep intellectual dive, which certainly was important and certainly helped me. But if I'm honest, I don't think there was I wasn't really able to kind of objectively just look at all the data, so to speak. It was more, I almost intuitively felt like this God has to be real. Otherwise, I don't know how I'm going to cope with the reality of him not being real, right? Of there being no meaning to my life. And so I think that was almost the primary impulse that then drove me to almost then look to reason-based evidence that is real, that is very good and very compelling, I think, in my opinion. But it was almost like I had to believe that there was a God because despair was too terrifying for me to believe otherwise. And then I had to almost prove that my belief in God wasn't just this intuition, but that there were rational reasons for that, as opposed to me being in maybe a more objective state, or even being a straight, like a full-blown materialist atheist, where it's like, oh, actually, I don't think there's a God, but now I'm going to kind of explore the evidence in an even-mannered way, and try to see which one makes more sense. If that kind of makes sense.
Right. My guest is Christopher Hazell. He is sharing with us his story from atheistic college student to essentially now faithful Catholic. And he has just paused at sharing with us how interiorly the sense of not having a God and the terror that induced caused him to ponder the existence of God. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. We're talking with Christopher Hazell. He is sharing with us his journey from atheism to now Catholicism. Now, Christopher, you touched on something rather poignant that I'd like to ask you to speak into. The reason I said your story is familiar is not because I've heard it a million times before, but it's because it mirrors a lot of my own journey. And so much of what you're sharing is deeply personal to me. And one of the things you highlighted that I resonate with, and undoubtedly our listeners do as well, is the thought of a godless existence induces a kind of existential terror within the soul. Can you please speak to that from a personal perspective? And there are many listeners who might be able to relate with that, or they know people who relate with that. So speak to it from a personal perspective, and also share why you think that is. Why does a soul react that way when it suddenly starts thinking about a godless existence?
Yeah, for me, that experience really was a grace in that it woke me up, right, to, it was a symptom of my living. And so I was essentially, it's interesting. I think a lot about, like, if someone had asked me back then, like, did you believe in God? I mean, I would have said, sure, I do. But I was a practical atheist in that God had no bearing on my life, right? And so when I had kind of this anxiety of the soul, if you will, right, or this terror, it was the realization, right, that my life, like everything that had made up my life, the people I loved in my life, the dreams that I had, like everything that the narrative of my life, right, that I had built in my head, so to speak, that it really maybe was a complete fiction in the sense that it meant nothing. And so everything that I worked for, dreamed of, or the things that I thought were somehow meaningful were not actually meaningful in and of themselves, because without God, and I know that there's all sorts of ways that we can kind of, I think, delude ourselves into thinking that there's meaning when there's no God. But for me, I couldn't really buy that. Like, it was either there's a God and there's some transcendent kind of ontological reality that gives meaning to me and everyone else, or there isn't, and we can pretend that there maybe is, but at the end of the day, we there isn't, right? At least I couldn't see how we could say that there is. And so that feeling, I mean, it's a horrible feeling. It's because it's a type of pain that is unique. I think a lot. I haven't really experienced any pain like that since, which is really kind of a pain of the soul, where the soul is almost. It's hard to explain, but it's a deep sense that I'm alienated almost from myself, and it's terrible, because there's a sense of isolation in that if there's no meaning, then why am I here? And if there's no reason for me to be here, then how can I really find motivation to live a life, right? And I know that not everyone necessarily responds that same way to that question, of course, but for me, that was really what it was this sense of, like, how can I not despair? Because I now really have no motivation to continue living if I feel that at the end of the day, there's no bottom to anything, so to speak, right? That in 100 years, whatever I did or didn't do is not going to matter. And I think, and then the second part of your question, like why, kind of like why that might be, I do think that, I think it's an amazing thing that God has created us, and he has said and given us this opportunity to participate in this grand eternal story that has real consequences, both for ourselves and for the people who touch us in our lives and whose lives we touch. That God gives us such dignity in saying, you have power in this creation to choose where you will be forever, and to help bring people either to a place against God or for God. And this isn't trivial. Like, it's not, right? It's not a game. It's real. And of course, God's the one who does all this through us. And, he's the divine storyteller, so to speak. But I think I just feel like we intuitively sense that our lives should mean something.
Mm-hmm.
I think like we're born with the sense of my love matters, that I have an identity, that my life isn't meaningless, that I'm not just like a speck of organic life in a blind, cold universe, that, it doesn't really matter whether I'm here or not. Even if we maybe intellectually can like assent to that belief, I just feel in our heart there's some deep place where we feel like that's it shouldn't be that way, at the very least. Like, it's a tragedy that it is, right? And I think if we're living from that place, we really don't know who we are, which is, created by God to love him, to be with him, to love others, like literally created us as children. I mean, if we don't have an identity, then it's hard for me to understand how we can really approach this thing that we call life. And so at least for me, that was, I think, what was so painful about it and why it was so detrimental. And I mentioned this in the essay, Viktor Frankl, right? You would see these, in his concentration camp, right? He would see the people who had meaning in their life and felt like they were part of something bigger.
Mm-hmm.
They tended to survive, or at least did better than the people who didn't, who kind of shriveled up and then ended up dying. It was almost like their soul died before their body did, so to speak. And so I don't know if that gets at what you're asking, but for me, at least, it did seem we have to have a role to play. I think, like, we're meaning machines, in the sense of we have to believe that we matter. And I think God implanted that desire for us to matter because we do matter.
And because we do matter, learning the meaning of our mattering in that sense is a fundamental component to learning how to live rightly. And that's getting at the heart of this existential question, right? And so you were influenced by people like Camus and Sartre. Can you share about how the kind of people we read, the kind of thoughts we allow to influence us, can have a great impact in not just the concept of meaning, but also simply our eventual outlook on life in general?
Yeah, it's. I was talking to a friend recently about how there's a lot on TV or art, artwork or music, or that they're really, the artists are influenced by these ideas, right? These ideas of whether they're atheistic or vaguely agnostic, or just in some way not fundamentally Christian. And I feel, and me and my friend were just talking about how, you can watch a movie or something that is kind of technically very good still, like very well acted, and the story might even be very great and entertaining and interesting. And yet there's some, movies or books that I'll read, whether it's fiction or it's a philosophical tract or something, or right, that just leave me feeling, it's an echo of what I felt perhaps those years ago, which is like there's a feeling of kind of emptiness that I get from it. And I think because a lot of times in these films, or again, if we're reading certain philosophers, where ultimately life has no meaning and therefore life is absurd, therefore we maybe try to create our meaning with, varying degrees of success, depending on whether someone can convince themselves that they can create meaning in their own life. I think those ideas can reach our kind of subconsciously can reach us and really create kind of a nascent despair. And if not despair, maybe just like a kind of a malaise. Walker Percy used to talk about malaise. This Catholic writer, he would write about this, like, we're all stuck in the malaise. In the Moviegoer, this novel, he writes about this. And I think that's what ends up happening, right? We can kind of like become kind of these, what's the term I'm looking for, right? Like kind of like we become kind of zombies in a way to these ideas that our lives don't really matter. And therefore we might as well just entertain ourselves, or busy ourselves, or not think about things. Because if we do think about things, and we think about, who we are or what our life really is, that might be extremely depressing, because, right, we might come to realize at the bottom of it, the bottom of it, we don't like who we are or the life we're living, or don't think that we have any direction in our life. And so I just remember that I would, and I think a lot of it was like, it wasn't like I would read a lot of material and just immediately be like, oh, this is negative. This is negatively affecting me. I think it was much more insidious than that. It would be, I would read, and I think there's a place to read ideas like this, of course, in a way to understand. But for me, not being very well catechized and not really having a rooted sense of what is truth, I was just reading and encountering these different ideas. And I wasn't maybe consciously aware that they were changing my view of the world, and they were changing how I was treating people. Because in some subtle way, I think, if love isn't real, so to speak, if there's no real sense in being a good person, because there is no good or evil or anything, it's really just kind of how we value acts, then I think slowly we can start rationalizing how we treat people. We can start rationalizing our selfish behaviors in some ways. And again, I think a lot of this is, at least for me, a lot of it just happened without me consciously thinking about it very much. I kind of found myself like, wait a minute, I don't like who I'm becoming, or I'm starting to lie, or whatever it is, right?
Well, I wish we could continue. Actually, at the end of the segment, I greatly enjoyed this conversation. I'm actually looking forward to future conversations with you. Thank you so much for your time. I've been talking with Christopher Hazell. He wears many hats as an author. You can find him on his Substack, Ends in Mind. His most recent article is The Anti-Narrative of Sin and Evil on Word on Fire. Please do read it and contemplate on it. I'm Marcus Peter.